All right, we are back. How's everyone doing? And again, the transition doesn't work, despite the fact that I fixed it. Okay, well, hello everyone.
Going well, it's always stellar.
Welcome to another episode of Through Our Eyes podcast, which totally comes with added extra technical difficulties.
Oh yeah.
I will hand it straight over to our lovely co-host to introduce you to the Through Our Eyes project, what it's all about. I'm sorry, did I put you on the spot there?
No, that's okay. My brain has been on everything else, but that's fine. Hello, everyone. Welcome in to this next episode of the Through Our Eyes podcast. Yes, the Through Our Eyes podcast started last year, beginning of 2021, essentially, when I wanted to try and use the platform that I had to speak to marginalised creators and communities and try and learn more about things I didn't know about and thus things other people might not know about, and ask those really awkward questions that you really want to know the answers to, but you really don't want to ask that question. So we started the streams and we interviewed a lot of wonderful people, raised a lot of money for charity, and then we very rightly realised that having 30 guests over 10 hours is great, but you don't really get to know anyone individually. And so Dracthonia and I put together the Through Our Eyes podcast, where we bring on individual creators and people from the games industry for a 2-hour conversation where we get to learn about people specifically.
Yeah, so obviously with this being a podcast recording, the alerts are hopefully off. And if you wish to submit any questions for our current guest, there is a channel points redemption in the chat. We won't be interacting too much directly with the chat because obviously we want to focus on the topic that we're discussing, and to make sure that our guest is given the ample time and attention that they deserve. So, speaking about our guest, hello, would you like to introduce yourself, your handles, what you do, and your pronouns, please?
I can do that, yes. So hi everyone, my name's Rosie, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a comms officer and community manager for a mental health charity in the games industry called Safe in Our World. I feel like I can't really say I'm a streamer anymore because it's been a while, but I will get back there. It's just I've had this like weird, 6 months of moving house and then like kind of being in limbo of everything, so I've not really done anything. But yeah, occasional streamer and podcaster as well, so it's really nice to be on a fellow podcast.
All right, and why are you here today?
Well, I mean, firstly, because I was very nicely invited, so thank you for inviting me to come on. I actually I know Pan from charity life,
Yep.
which is always nice. So we've kind of done a podcast swap at this point, which is lovely, because we actually first started chatting back, I don't even know when it was at this point.
Earlier this year sometime.
Sometime in 2022, about the crossover that we both have within charity work and games, which is awesome. And so I guess I'm here to talk about what I talk about all the time anyway, but what I get paid to do, which is great, is talk about mental health, specifically within the gaming industry and within games, video games, the creator lifestyle, like everything really. So yeah, I guess that's why I'm here, but I'm really excited to chat about like the specifics and about your thoughts as well on this topic.
Gosh, that's a first.
I want
to hear. We don't usually get our star a bit.
Listen, it's two podcasts they're coming together. I'm going to ask you questions too.
Good point.
Is that allowed?
Oh God, we're on the spot now.
Am I ruining the system?
Oh dear. Well, before we get overexcited about that and get distracted by actually the promise of being interrogated, we would first like to hear a little bit about your story. Give us the lowdown of your experience and why it got you to this point.
Sure, yeah. So I've always been passionate about mental health, but it's kind of very much been a topic that was discussed a lot more during the pandemic, of course. And I've always kind of experienced poor mental health in a way. So I guess oh God, I don't even know what year it would be, but when I was at school, I was having a bad time. I'm not gonna lie. Like it was a really difficult time, and at that point it wasn't really discussed at schools in education about like how to look after yourself, and especially during like anyone who's been through any sort of academia knows the amount of pressure that it can put on people, which is why I'm never going back to academia.
Amen to that.
It's just, yeah, oh God, like I have a lot of respect for people who can do it, but I can't, and there's a lot of flaws in the system that I think need to be worked out before it's a safe place for people to go mental health wise. But basically it all kind of swelled into a massive breakdown, as it usually does. And then I decided actually I probably need to get some help with this. I don't think I can do it by myself anymore, which took like 6 years too long. But we got there in the end, and that's the most important thing. And so I started on medication. I went to university. I was like, oh my God, this is awful. It's like a great time, but also awful. I don't understand. Like it's very conflicting. And so I was kind of confused because everyone, is saying like university is meant to be the best time of your life. Or, well, they said school's meant to be the best time of your life. And then I was like, well, maybe the other ones are right about university. Went to university, wasn't the best time of my life. I was like, I feel like I've been lied to. And then I suffered a loss, an unexpected loss from one of my flatmates and friends at the time. And it shook everyone within our space. But I don't know why, but it really affected me to the point where I started having kind of like regular panic attacks, more so than usual. They'd happen like every time I was out with people or like at university, in lectures, on the bus. Like it was terrible. And so I've got a point to this, I promise. And then after all of that happened, I had to really take a step back and like actually take some time for myself, which is when I got heavily back into gaming. I've always kind of been a gamer and like played a lot, and I used to like play or watch my brother play games because I wasn't allowed to touch the controllers. Or I could be watching him play Spyro or The Hobbit or The Sims, and so I always loved them, but I never really had too much time to play them by myself. And so I took a PlayStation to uni with me and discovered like all of these games. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I found flatmates that also loved games. And so it just kind of became this safe haven in a space that was actually really hard to navigate, with the added pressure of grieving, with being in education in a place that does not really support people with mental health issues, which I figured out after I went to the student counsellor and I said like, oh, I need help, and they were like, cool, we'll put you on the wait list. And I was like, okay, how long's the wait list? They were like, 2 years. I was like, oh, okay. I won't be here in 2 years, but thank you for that. So I kind of like fell into games a lot to lean on them as a support mechanism. And after university, I started working in charity. Not this charity. I started working in a first aid charity. And that was about a year before the pandemic started. And so I was having a great time. I just moved to London. I was like, oh my God, this is really cool. I am in a job where I feel like I'm really, hitting my stride with this. I'm in a city that I'm really enjoying, and I get to go into the centre all the time and like, oh my God, this is awesome. I got to do events as part of that. I was the like coordinator for the New Year's Eve on Embankment, like the fireworks and was for like Notting Hill Carnival and Wimbledon and stuff, and it was awesome. And then COVID happened, and all of that went away, and I didn't get made redundant, but my role had to essentially massively change in order to keep me in employment, and so we moved into like the national response of first aid and support, and I ended up coordinating the volunteers for the Nightingale Hospital in Excel, which was terrifying and really wild and really quite harrowing being there, which as you can imagine probably didn't help like the general unease of the whole country or the whole world at that point, right? And so yeah, mental health took a tumble, and then I decided, actually, you know what, maybe I'll just put everything into my job. And that's when it became a real problem, because I was taking advantage of the fact that I was using all of this negative energy to put into working myself into overdrive. I started having panic attacks again at work. I got incredibly depressed. And yeah, it was probably the worst time of my life. And then I decided I needed to leave that job for the sake of my own mental health. And at the time in Excel, I met someone who was a trustee for Safe in Our World, and we got chatting about The Last of Us. I think it was part 2 had just come out. We were like, oh my God, it's so exciting. We love The Last of Us. And she was just like, oh, that's cool. I'm a trustee for a charity called Safe in Our World, which is all about mental health in games. And I was like, I'd never considered that before. That's really interesting. And she was like, well, there's a job coming up if you want it. And I was like, oh my God, this is meant to be. Tell me more. And here we are. So yeah, it's now coming up nearly 2 years. It'll be 2 years in a couple of weeks of working with Safe and being able to talk very openly about mental health and trying to promote well-being in teams, instead of kind of suffering on the other end of that. So it's been a wild journey, but a really worthwhile one for me. And I feel like I've done a lot, but not a lot at the same time. But yeah, that's a very long-winded way of saying now what I do.
I mean, no, we asked for a start. But you said that at the end of your last job, that your mental health was taking a dive. You did also seek help during that period, or was it just the change that helped solve that?
Honestly, a lot of it was being pushed from my job. So because of the thing that I was doing, and because I was working in a hospital basically for a while, but not really, I was asked to move to a hotel, and I was there for about 6 weeks, and it was just by myself in a hotel room. It was very bleak, and that was a huge factor in being able to like make me feel terrible. And that was when I decided I needed to leave. And then after that, I got to move back home for a bit, and we got a cat, which honestly helped a lot. God rest his soul, Graham. I miss you so much. Oh, blah. But yeah, so that helped a lot, and I was able to get my medication again, because at the time everything was closed. It was chaos. I was living in a hotel. I couldn't really get my medication. I couldn't sort out anything. And so having that sense of normality gave me then a push to be able to be like, I can apply for other jobs. I can do this now. I'm working from home. I'm like seeing a different environment for the first time. I'm not having 12-hour days in an office by myself. And that was huge and fundamental to me, being able to make that change. So yeah, it was kind of a combination of a lot of different things. But yeah.
And are you still on medication?
I am, yes. I think I will be for a long time, to be honest. It's been a bit of a journey for me. I've been on a lot of different types. Oh, my voice decided to go. So if anyone's not been on medication before, in chat or anything, like, it's especially with antidepressants specifically, they don't know very much about them. And so I basically got told that when I first went to the doctor, and I was like, hey, and he was like, you probably are depressed and have anxiety. I was like, okay, now what? And he was like, well, we can give you some medication. And I was like, all right, cool. What one? And he was just like, well, we don't know yet. Like it might not work out. We'll just try. It's basically trial and error. And I was like, excuse me, you're a medical professional. Are you sure? And he was just like, yeah, that's how it works. And so it was a whole journey of going through that. But I am still on medication. And it's been a life changer, probably a lifesaver for me personally. I know there's a bad rep around medication. But ultimately for me, it's putting my brain in a mindset where I'm able to think a little bit more clearly. It doesn't fix or cure anything, but it makes you, it evens things out enough for you to be able to make a change. So
yeah, I think between all of us here on the podcast, we've probably done a whole range of off-on, trying this one, that one, this one.
yeah. I'm assuming other people have just been like, oh, I don't need these anymore, I'll just come off them, and it's like the worst mistake you've ever done in your life.
I mean, I didn't titrate off too quickly and cause myself major issues, and I'm still recovering from that one and wondering why I chose that decision at all. No, don't know what I'm about.
Me neither. It's so weird.
Whereas I can cold turkey off medications with no problems, which is weird, but I only attribute that to being in so much pain and weird medical or like mental distress all the time anyway that I didn't notice.
I mean,
because I came off of sertraline after having been on it for 10 years, a couple of years ago, and then went back on it as of 3 or 4 months ago. Because I think a lot of people think that depression is just really bad, sad, and it's not really
not
bad.
Quite.
It can be really bad, sad, but there's lots of other things. And I mean, for me, it manifested, at least when I was having a very bad time, as just complete emptiness, just nothingness. Like, not even anger. Like, anger would have been nice, but it was just a nope.
Complete apathy.
Just a nope. Yeah. And so that's the point where I was like, I need to get some help with this again, because you can't just keep feeling absolute nope. I would rather be sad or angry to give me an emotion to process, but having a lack of emotion is definitely a problem.
Because you start not to care, right?
Yeah.
For me, that's what the sertraline did. So
yep, it's different for every person.
Like, yeah, great. So I can choose whether to be off of the medication and have woo, or I can choose to be on the medication where maybe it helps, or maybe it gives me all of these long list of other things that I have to deal with. And I mean, we could probably have a 2-hour conversation purely on medication alone and the medical state of things, but that's not what we're here for. So
just before we carry on, I do have another thing I just wanted to point out, because obviously normally when we start these podcasts, we end up going, and what does this mean for anyone that doesn't understand? And I know that obviously from speaking to you, Rosie, in the past, what some people don't seem to understand about mental health is that everyone has it, whether it's good or bad. So a lot of people say, well, I've never had mental health. It's like,
I mean, you have a brain, no?
So you have, it's just been good. So so when people experience periods of sort of like bad mental health, what can that look like for some people? Like, how would they be able to tell for those people that don't think they actually have mental health?
I mean, it's hard to tell, because if you've had poor mental health your whole life, you might think that you're fine because you've never known any different, which is always a bit scary to think about. But I think it's being, offset to the point where you change your daily life because you're affected by it so much. And that can be in ways that you might not recognize at first. Like I didn't think, I was so in denial about like being depressed for so long. I was just like, no, I'm in a phase. And then I was like, well, actually, it's been like 4 years. Maybe I'm not actually in a phase. But it really depends from person to person. Like for some, I'm like, we were talking about this very briefly before the start of the podcast, but I'm currently looking into ADHD diagnosis because it's not something I ever considered for myself until I started seeing all of these other people who are people who are adults with ADHD talking about their own symptoms and how they have seen ADHD manifest within themselves. And I was like, oh my God, I relate to so many of these. Like, I just thought this was just me. Actually, that's like a neurodivergent thing. That's really interesting. And so I think for a lot of people who maybe haven't considered, having mental health issues, perhaps talking with other people is a great step to kind of figure out maybe what is quote unquote normal, what's healthy, and maybe what you could probably do with changing or supporting yourself with, because sometimes it's really hard to identify self-destructive habits if it's just you who's noticing them, because you probably don't think that they're an issue. But yeah, I mean, that's my opinion. I don't know. It manifests differently for everyone. But just keeping track, and if you're a journaler, journaling is helpful to be able to track things like mood and, but yeah, I don't want to ramble too much. I'm very good at that. Why did you invite me on the podcast?
It's okay. We've got 2 hours. Please ramble.
You're all good. Did you know that rambling is a sign of ADHD?
Oh man.
Honestly, my ADHD assessment was a fucking nightmare because the woman kept looking at me going, Paige, I'm trying to take notes. Could you stop talking? And I was like, have you got your answer yet? Susan. Like,
oh,
must
I
have 6
know.
or 7 times. And I'm just like, sorry. Whoops.
I think that's probably one of the hardest parts of doing a podcast as well. Both Pan and I are quite a rambly people. And then there's a case where we're sat in a podcast going, we need to focus on this one question for long enough and not interrupt and not go off topic. Oh, why are we talking about constipation? How is this happening?
I always get that, or like with the guest, they'll be talking about something and it's like, oh, I have a really long anecdote that I could tell them, but it's probably not really relevant and I probably shouldn't do that, but also I could do that and then it'll actually engage the conversation. And then it's really hard to refrain and jump in and stop them talking because they're making a really good point and you just want to talk about something dumb.
That's why probably most of the time I look kind of like I'm phased out, is because I'm spending the entire time going,
don't say it, don't say it.
Don't say it. Don't.
Exactly.
But I think that topic brings us nicely onto our next question of why is mental health an important topic to discuss?
Well, I think, as Pan put it very well, everyone has mental health, and whether that's good or bad. And so I think it's like pretty much everyone will experience poor mental health at some point in their life. And so from a purely like statistical point of view, it's important because you're going to know about it. Whether that's, through yourself or through people you love or people you know, and being just, a general good person. Empathy is a good thing to have. And so learning about mental health, talking about it and destigmatizing it is ultimately going to make the world a safer place for people who are really in a vulnerable position. A lot of people, I think, and it's still around, is that kind of thing, is if someone's depressed or if someone is suicidal, then it's, everything is frustrating, annoying, or they're attention seeking until the worst happens, and then it's like a tragedy, right? And so there's never any prevention. It's just oh no, this happened, that's very sad, we should do more about this, and then nothing changes. So it's incredibly important for us to be talking about this topic, especially during one of the most like significant mental health declines in the country and probably in the world over the last few years, especially with the pandemic, now with the cost of living and everything. I know that it's not just about hereditary factors that can affect your mental health. There are other things, there are external stimuli that will affect you, and even just learning about emotional resilience can be so important to people. So it's like something that's embedded in our entire lives, and so many things are connected that you don't realize at first. And so like even So, for example, obviously my mental health nosedived after I was experiencing a bereavement. You can't control that in your life, and I'm sure everyone will have or has experienced bereavement before. And that is something that obviously can very much affect your mental health and your well-being. So it's kind of everywhere right now, which is why we need to talk about it, which is why we need to be more emotionally resilient, which is why we need to be there for each other and support each other before tragedies happen, before like these things get taken to somewhere where they can't come back from. And yeah, I don't know, it's for me it's just being a it's not empathetic, well it is, but like a reasonable human being, accounting for other people's feelings and trying to make the world a little bit of a better place, I guess.
And the thing is that, as you were saying, like with the fact that it's now an increasing issue for a lot of people, the more average Joe, so to speak, will actually be becoming more aware of the fact that they themselves are as prone to it as anyone else. It's better to talk about these things in an open and honest way rather than continuing to perpetuate that, oh, you're a Debbie Downer or whatever your various assumption is, or just, you know, just get on with it kind of attitude, when increasingly more and more it's going to be a huge increasing issue, especially on like health services and just generally businesses trying to operate around an ever increasing and developing mental health decline. It's one of those things that we really should talk about before it gets to that point.
Yeah, exactly. Because it has a knock-on effect as well. Like, you know, obviously, the more people who are hospitalized for mental health. I'm not trying to make this sound like a bad thing. It's coming out wrong, but like, it's everything adds pressure to an already boiling pot, and we have the capability to educate and support each other and not have to necessarily push a system over the edge to be able to help people. And I think we should use it and help each other. Like, there's so much information out there, there's so much going on, and yet people still are like, oh, but mental health, I don't really want to talk about that. Scary, boo, hiss. And that's kind of why I want to talk about it in more of a positive way, because it's like, it does not have to be this really serious conversation that you have with someone in a dark room with a cup of tea and all the lights are off. Like, it doesn't have to be terrifying. Or maybe not, like cold water, lukewarm water, even worse. But it's like, whenever I talked about it at school, it was like I was brought into an office and sat down, and it was incredible. I was like sweating, nervous. I could barely speak because, oh my God, this is really intense. I don't want to talk about it in this sort of setting. Like, can we not just go for a walk and chat quickly and briefly about it? And like, I was like shamed for my humor. That was a huge coping mechanism for me, and it still is, and it is for a lot of people. And it's like not necessarily a bad thing. It's about being able to talk about a very serious topic in a more lighthearted way and encourage other people to join in that conversation, rather than gatekeep the conversation around mental health, which is something that does happen. Because I think people get nervous about terminology and nervous about getting it right, and not saying the wrong thing to the point where they don't say anything at all, which is an issue as well. So it's important to embrace people learning about this topic and allowing each other to learn from each other, and like, things change over time as well. So yeah, just be more accepting of helping other people learn about a huge topic in our life.
And a period of poor mental health doesn't necessarily equate to mental illness, and mental illness isn't an inherently bad thing. I do think a lot of people are scared to talk about mental health because of popular media, and how often it is that mental health and mental illness is stigmatized, going back, 70, 80 years into a lot of older films, like even things like the original Invisible Man film, where they were like, oh, he's gone mad and he's drunk these things and now he's killing people, it must be because he's a madman. It's like, no, dude poisoned himself. Like, that's, he might be acting a bit strange, he literally poisoned himself. And then you go on to Psycho, which was a man without any support system, having lost a parent and then having no idea how to cope. And obviously it's interesting because it's a horror villain, but all it does is demonize somebody that had mental health needs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like if you ever saw any tragedy in the news, the first thing you would hear from usually, parents or friends was, oh, I bet they had something wrong with them in the head. And it's like, why are you saying that? Like, people don't need to, like, sometimes people are just dickheads.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It's always the connection between this person did something inherently evil, therefore they must be mentally ill. And often that's not the case. And it associates this terrible stigma with people who maybe do have that condition that function perfectly fine and have no issues with that. It's always about like the 1% that people hang on to. And it's the same thing with video games, and the stigma that video games make you violent, video games make you sit in your room by yourself and in a dark room, and it's really sad and depressing. And it's like, actually,
have you thought that that's my solution to having to deal with you lot? But on the front of the attitude towards mental health, I wouldn't actually say that it is particularly media that is driving this. I think it is in my experience, at least, and from what I've heard a lot of other people talk about, it's actually like a passed down stigma of it. When I started suffering from my mental health issues, the person that stopped me wasn't media. It wasn't friends judging me. It was the fact that my mother was the one telling me, no, don't say anything because it'll go on your permanent medical record and you'll never get a job. Now that's more of a familial like stigma that's passed down through generations of how the older generations have been led to believe that showing any kind of weakness is a detriment to their potential careers. I don't think that's something that's like media instilled. That's a long running, like,
societal. Yeah, 100%. Like my when I told my grandma that I was going on medication, I thought it was a win. I was like, oh my God, I'm finally going to do something about this. And she was like, oh, Rosie, oh, that's not good. And I was like, wait, what? And she was just mortified that I have to take medication, that I can't just make myself better by like getting some vitamin D and going for a walk. So yeah, it's 100%. I think a mix of societal, but I think also media is influenced by society too. So it's kind of like those two interconnecting all the time.
Yeah, it wasn't to say that wasn't an effect, just more
of
a...
No,
I think it's one of the feed-ins. Sorry, go on, Pan.
That's all right. I was going to say something else. I forgot what I was saying, and then I support. Basically, I was just going to say, yeah, media I think definitely is one of those things because of popular presentation, and it's what we've seen a lot in other things that influence mental health, like the obsession with body image, which a lot of people will say isn't a thing, but if you grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, you still feel the effects of it to this day. And that goes for all different genders and sexualities and everything. Everything is cis heteronormative, skinny, white, and has 2 kids attached usually once you get out the lingerie shops. And it's everything for that creates another expectation, like you said earlier, Rosie, to like live your life a certain way and end up in a certain way, which isn't your fault if you don't want to. Not everyone has to. But then it does lead to this very unfortunate circumstance of tradition, which, as I love a quote, I don't remember where it came from, it's just peer pressure from the dead. And it's just older generations do seem to say, well, you know, in my day we just got on with it. It's like, no, in your day you got put in insane asylums that didn't need to exist because you didn't know how to deal with it, and you treated hysteric women with treatments we shan't necessarily talk about because you didn't know how to handle mental health. People have never been treated well when it comes to mental health or general health, unfortunately, in history. But it was much easier to pretend that they did because you just hid the problem, which I think is where what you do and what Safe in the World does is so valuable, because you can't just hide it anymore. The internet's so big and vast, anyone can say anything they want very, very quickly, and that message can spread. So why not say the right thing and the good thing to actually help someone?
Yeah. It's like, it always baffles me how there's people like on this planet that are like, hey, I'm going to use my voice for hate and only hate. I'm just going to spread malice everywhere. Like, I've just never quite understood that. I'm guessing it's some kind of projection or like, need that they feel they have to do, but because they're angry at the world or whatever. But I'm just like, there's so much good to share and there's so much support to be able to help each other with, that we can focus on. Oh, hi, Kat.
Oh, hi, Streaks.
She's about to go and attack the window, don't worry.
I love it.
I just realised the door's closed, so Ty's probably going to be upset with me.
Okay,
Oh, no.
so just to keep the ball rolling on our train of thought before we get distracted. So what are some of the issues that you've come across in the field as a creator or as someone working in a mental health-based charity?
So, yeah, it's interesting. I think there's this kind of unspoken feud between mental health professionals and mental health advocates, which isn't really talked about very much. And I think personally that there should be a healthy mix of both. I don't think you need to be a mental health professional to talk about mental health, especially your own. You know your brain better than anybody. But I think those who choose advocacy in mental health need to be very conscious of the words that they say and the people that they're talking to and how they can affect that. And so language is a very interesting one to talk about, because as someone who is very public facing and also like podcasting and stuff, I'm sure that you both have this as well. You have to be very considerate with the words that you use to make sure that things don't get misconstrued or they don't come across like in the way that you didn't intend. And mental health can be very similar, because you have to be very careful about what you say and who you're talking to and how you say it. And that's always been an issue, I think, potentially in those who maybe don't know how to talk responsibly about mental health, who maybe offer advice rather than resources and support, and really toe the line between peer support and treating someone, which is unethical. So being very careful to make sure that advocacy doesn't draw into the line of advice giving is a thing for me. But that's like a really weird sort of niche one. I think the other issues that you can get are like, obviously people not taking you seriously or mocking for talking about mental health, and you're always going to get that, I think, no matter what you're talking about. There are people who have different opinions for you, and that's the internet, and that's just something, unfortunately, that we have to deal with at the moment. But yeah, there will always be people who don't take you seriously and mock you, and they probably haven't had anything mental health wise affect them in their life, or if they have, that they're trying to suppress that. Oh gosh, what else? I mean, within games specifically, there's a lot of barriers that we face. I'm sure anyone who's observed the games industry for any amount of time has seen the horrors that have come out of this industry in terms of well-being, crunch, discrimination, bullying at work. Like, there's so much in this industry that needs to change. And that's not to say that there isn't positives happening, because there definitely are, and we're working with so many companies on making positive change and trying to create hope. However, there are always companies who will sadly be the reason that we need to still exist. And I'm obviously not going to name names or anything like that, but that is always a barrier for me, is that it sometimes feels like for everything you're doing well, someone else is kind of shooting it down in the other corner of the world, and it's like, why? Come on, we're making strides. So that's something, and I think it's something as well that people will refer to it as maybe a reason why they don't want to tackle such a big subject, where they're just like, well, this is always going to happen, so there's no point, like change isn't going to happen because these people are at the top. And I totally understand that, because it can feel quite hopeless when seniority has a very damning cis white straight male view of the world, and you know, that can be incredibly disheartening for a lot of people in the industry to think. But it's not all doom and gloom. And I guess what we're trying to do at Safe in Our World and within the industry in general is promoting our own self-worth. Like, this industry is full of passion and people will take advantage of that. But if you know your own worth and you know your own boundaries before you start applying for things and getting into opportunities, whether that's like creator-led or oh god, words are hard, job-led. Not that the two can't coexist, but if you're pursuing a career in games versus maybe trying to work with a partnership on a creator side, yeah, being able to hold standards, hold people accountable, talk to other people who are going through the same sort of thing, and create a support network of a lot of different people to make the industry a safer place is what we're trying to do, I guess. And by, you know, fostering that normal conversation and positive change around it. So I forgot the question. I've just been like spiraling.
What are the major issues in the field as a creator?
But yeah, yes, major issues. Sorry, like railroaded that. As a creator, it's challenging, because I think sometimes when you're talking about these really passionate things, and maybe you have like quite a small base or like a small following or something, you might feel like, I've certainly thought it when I first started the podcast, I didn't really have any listeners, and I was like, maybe no one really cares about what I'm talking about. Maybe I should just give up with this, because it's like, it's, if no one's listening, what's the point? But then also I've kind of learned from that it doesn't really matter if anyone's listening, because if you believe in it, it's not taking up too much of your energy necessarily. And it's like, it's kind of broken into my personal life in a way, because I talk about this so much. I've had people come to me and say like, oh, you know, because of you, I've like gone to the doctor about my mental health. And I was like, okay, that's first of all incredible. And like, I might cry in a little bit, because I'm going to get really emotional about it. And that's amazing. And like, just being able to help like one person literally like go and get support is worth it. So like, that's a barrier that I think I've overcome at this point, or trying to. But I know that it's still one that very much exists in a lot of people, is that maybe they're not getting the viewership that they want, and that affects their mental health and such. But yeah, I think they're the main challenges. I mean, yeah, I mean, you're always like, no matter the subject, you're always going to get like trolls and stuff like that will make your life harder as a creator and make it more difficult to talk about what you're passionate about. But ultimately, it's like a weird set of niche barriers that I think it will depend on person to person on what their vulnerabilities are. So, yeah.
So
Even if you help, even if you help one person or you educate one person, that one person could influence a million others, and you maybe never even know it, but like it is one of those things. I definitely think for people who are neurodiverse as well, where numbers are, like for me, numbers are way more difficult to quantify, because my brain will go big or small and that's it. So it's like, oh no, 6 people have seen this, that means I have failed. But
Yeah.
like if there was 6 people in a room with me watching me do something, I'd be like, ew, go away, there's too many of you. So it's a very different thing between what's tangible and what's not tangible. But that one person who you're able to help may then be able to get one of their friends to go to the doctor and get some help, and that person might tell an audience hall of 40 people to go and talk to people if they need help, and it may just go from there. So
Yeah, exactly.
it's
Like
really, yeah, it's difficult to get yourself to understand, especially if you're not neurotypical and you have difficulty visualizing, but everything you do has worth to someone.
yeah, and it cascades more than you think. Like my dad called me a few months ago now and was like, what does she, her mean in your email? And I was like, oh, it's this. And he was like, oh, right, maybe I should do that. And I was like, okay. And then he's talked about me for a bit, and then he rang me like a week later and was like, so I spoke to my manager and we're all doing it now. And he works for like this pneumatics company that it's not a known thing to do something like that. It's very, 20 years behind everything in that sort of context. But I was just like, that's so cool that you had that conversation with your manager, because I was like just chatting shit on a call and sent you an email for no reason, and we've ended up here. So yeah, things go further than you think.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring the conversation around to the gaming side of things for a bit, before we ended up down a different rabbit hole. So you were saying about how obviously in the actual industry there's quite a few issues, but I wanted to focus more on like how do games play into mental health, and what effect can they have, whether that be positive or negative.
Yeah, it's it's kind of what drew me into this in the beginning. Is I had a personal connection with The Last of Us. And there's an article going out tomorrow on Safe in Our World which talks about this, and I was like very excited to be involved in it. And people have so many like personal connections to games which have helped them through various things in their life, whether they know it or not. And that's on the positive side, of course. Like, not to say that there are not negative things that happen in games. Of course there are. But that's kind of what drew me to Safe on Our World, and what kickstarted the charity in a way. Aside from the industry, so many people have played games that have maybe said that they've saved their life. We have often had people send in stories, and there's a lot of stories on the website as well about people's journeys through mental health, and what game maybe have helped them get through that, or what character that they have resonated with to a point where they felt seen and they felt more comfortable with their identity. And so it spans more than just mental health and just kind of like comfortableness within it. We talk to people about how certain characters have helped them come out to people, which is amazing. We've talked to people who have gone through a character that maybe experiences anxiety and depression and thought, actually, I understand how this person feels. Maybe I should get some support. Representation in games is incredible to help people with their own identity, and that's a huge thing of what we focus on. So a lot of my job is actually looking through games to see the bigger picture behind them. So like, just off the top of my head, there's a game called Ruya, which is on our website, and it's like a mobile game that looks very simple. It's kind of like a mixy match game. And I spoke to the developer about it, and he was like, oh, actually, yeah, it's about postpartum depression and how mothers can feel really alone. And when you look into the story side of things, it's all about like her giving everything for her children. And I was like, oh my God, it would literally just, what? And so talking about that, it's like not just about players' reactions to games, but also developers' intentions with games and what they wanted to see out from it, because it's such a creative field, right? And so many people put their heart and soul into the things that they create. And so naturally, games that come out have these incredible meanings behind them and evoke really massive things in people, which is such an interesting thing to look into, because it's games are the only media really that we connect with in the same way that you don't get from films. That's more of a passive media, which is totally fine, but it's passive and you're not in it at the same way that in a game you make the decisions, you're in control of the person. You feel like if something happens to them, it happens to you. And so it's a very interesting medium to put someone in to try and send a message, which is why I was so fascinated by it, and which is why The Last of Us was like, oh my God, this made me feel a lot of feelings. This is amazing. I didn't realize games could do that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the main side of it for me. But we also highlight games that have representation that's not stigmatized. So we were talking about this earlier within media, and you see it as well in a lot of horror games, is that you see, oh, it's in a mental hospital, oh, the main character is insane, is crazy. It's in our language that we stigmatize mental health, whether we notice it or not. And it's really hard to unlearn that, especially if you've grown up with that. And yeah, it feels almost like a guilty pleasure sometimes to enjoy a horror game, to think actually this could be quite damaging to someone's mental health. And we're seeing it now in, you know, the new wizard game that we're not going to speak the name of, that's damaging to people because of the intentions behind it and the people associated with it. So it's like, when people say that games aren't powerful, you can really look to things that can have such a profound effect on people and argue the opposite. And so that's been like massive for me. I guess like there's so many stories to be told, especially around things that you don't see very often. So I was talking to someone called Rami, who's in our industry. It's fantastic person.
Wonderful.
Right. And he was saying, like, you know, it's about the stories that you never see. Like, we are constantly seeing, you know, New York, a shooter game, or like a World War game where you're shooting people, versus a Yorkshire town maybe, or like an English thing, or in London. But you never see like these really small, quaint experiences that people experience in East Asia or in South Africa. Like, you just don't see that in games because it's not a fair industry in a lot of ways. And people in underprivileged parts of the world don't get the same opportunities that people in like the UK and America do. And you see that in places like GDC, which is exactly what he was talking about. And it's a really valuable conversation that he was having. And so that's why representation is so important. Like, if people don't see themselves in games or in developers, then the industry will never be a diverse place, and it will never be a fair place for people to enter. And why would we want to, you know, continually champion an industry that is not fair? So that's kind of why it's important for me. But yeah.
And when you're saying about representation, like you were saying that The Last of Us had quite an impact. Would you like to tell us a bit about that? What is it about The Last of Us that hit home for you?
It was interesting because it was the first game that made me feel anything. I was previously playing silly games. It was like, haha, this is fun. This is narrated by a funny person. Ha, I like this. And then it's suddenly like, oh dear God, this is really emotional. I feel uncomfortable with the actions that my character is doing, which I've never understood before from a video game. Because you, for the most part, when you're playing a game, you feel like you're in control. But when a game forces you to do things that you maybe would not want to do in real life or that you wouldn't consider doing, it puts you in a very strange, challenging and emotional position, which was something that I'd never thought could happen from a video game. And so that was like the first straw for me. The Last of Us 2 100% had that a lot. Like it made you do things that you did not want to do, and some I criticize it a little bit for some of the things that I did not want to do. I'm not saying the game is perfect at all, but it challenges people in a really interesting way. And the first game kind of, for me, instilled the fact that in a world that was incredibly bleak, there were still like pockets of hope in places that you wouldn't really expect it. And that was like, you see that with the giraffe scene, you see that in a lot of different, like little small subtle things. And when you're in a state of total depression, it is so valuable to be able to remember that little things like that exist, and that's why you keep going. And obviously, like, we're not in a zombie apocalypse in America, and I know that, but there are still lessons that you can learn from these characters that have gone through everything to stay with the people that they love. And whilst you can commend that, or, you know, say that it wasn't the right decision, it's kind of besides the point. It's a hypothetical situation, but yeah, the power of video games is what, or the power of The Last of Us is what drew me in, and the emotional kind of backlash that had, and the thought afterwards. Like, if I'm not going to spoil it, but it ends on a question basically, or a maybe. Which is unsettling for a lot of players, and then having to wait 7 years to actually understand what then happened is like very indicative of what life is like sometimes. So it just felt like they felt like very real characters because they were very flawed people, and it's not necessarily about having good people and bad people, it's just the people and the things that they do can be good or bad. So yeah, it's I have a lot of thoughts on The Last of Us, but they are the main ones. So
yeah, I would like to rewind for just 1 second to something you said, just because I was remembering what you said about Rami, and what Rami said about a few video games on Twitter, especially when talking about mental health. I think it's really important to also talk about intersectionality, because obviously, being a good advocate, you have to remember that everything interconnects, and that's not like you need to remember, Rosie, that's a royal you. Like,
of course,
obviously everyone needs to understand that things connect, but when you're playing your video games and you're playing another war game or another shooter game, you have to sort of try and remember who is often the enemy in those games, and it's normally not white cultures and not countries that are predominantly white. And the mental health toll that must take on the people who are constantly the enemy in a video game based on some racism really is fucking horrible. And you know, and people find it, you know, people freaked out about The Last of Us 2 when, you know, a main character got killed, but I don't see that energy anywhere else. And I get it, they're not the main character, but you do have to start asking the game developers, why is that the case? Then why are we not getting characters from more diverse backgrounds? Why are people freaking out when a video game has a femme Latina lead, even rumored femme Latina lead? Why is that a problem? And that's something I really appreciate about Rami's takes, because as I say, I'm white as milk. It's maybe not something that ever would have come up in my brain before, but when it's pointed out, you need to pay attention to it. And that's where I think, again, something like what Safe in Our World does is really important, because mental health needs are going to vary massively based on what you experience. And if you experience always being made the bad guy so that a hero can win, and that hero is a Western audience who is predominantly white, that's horrible. That is really horrible. And that's why I personally love playing games where you actually do have a cool, diverse group of characters, or you play as a character who is not who you live as in the real world. Like, that's great. And the other point I just wanted to say was actually on good representation, which is completely the flip side. I played a little indie game recently, which was a couple of quid on Steam. And it wasn't perfect. Not all the representations were perfect, but it had one of the cutest representations of a person with severe anxiety that I've ever seen. And it was called Speed Dating for Ghosts. And it was so cute. It's just this very simple concept, not a big game, just you sat across the table from somebody you're speed dating with, and it's just a ghost with very severe anxiety. And you can be a dick if you want to, you can be kind, you can be pandering, and they may not like you for that. But you can talk through things and actually sort of figure out what might be the right way to talk to somebody who is really anxious but trying. And I thought it was just a really lovely representation, because you can go through some pitfalls, and as you say, it can be really difficult to know what to say and whether to say the right, whether you're saying the right thing or the wrong thing, or if you're going to upset someone. And yeah, video games are a really great sounding board. So yeah, if you see that in a humble bundle, if it's on sale on Steam, Speed Dating for Ghost was a really, really cute game. And it did have a moment at the end where I was just like, I need to protect this ghost with my entire life. I need him to be okay. He's my favorite. What the fuck? He's so cute. Just little dude, little floating dude. It's just adorable.
And speaking of representation, could you think of any good representations that you've seen in games, media, anything that jumps out at you as something that's good representation of mental health?
Yeah, I mean, part of my job is to look for games that represent mental health well, or maybe tell a story about mental health that is educational or insightful. And so we have a bunch on there. I think, games like Life is Strange are very interesting conceptions of mental health. I think the one that does it most amazingly for me is Hellblade, which I'm sure everyone knows about and everyone's talked about it before, but it's talked about for a reason. Paul Fletcher was the mental health advisor on that, and he is part of our clinical board at SAFE, and he is fantastic. He's very well, he's incredibly knowledgeable and very humble. And he basically worked alongside a lot of people with lived experience to be able to capture what it is like with psychosis, or what maybe how you would have been treated with psychosis if you're in, I think it's like 8th century Pictish times or whatever it is in Hellblade. But that's always, I think it's always a green flag in a way if a lot of developers who are looking to represent people with mental health conditions have clinical advisors on board, or at least work with a group of advisors, whether that be advocates, lived experience, and clinicians, because I think it's important. And so there's lots of different examples of that, and I think there's a lot of ones that it's interesting because it depends on your own experience. Everyone will have slightly different experiences of mental health, and everyone will have different experiences of getting support within that. And it kind of links into what we were talking about earlier, in that as a very white person in the UK, mental health is looked at in a very different way than if you're black. And you see that a lot of the time in media, and like I'm talking about in news outlets, is that if you see someone who is, you can clearly see that they're having issues with mental health, and they're kind of painted as angry and dangerous rather than they're vulnerable and they need support. And so again, it's often hard for me to judge maybe what is good representation of something when it's only indicative from my own experiences. So I try to be very open about the fact that they're related games rather than recommendations or recommended games. What might be fantastic representation for someone of BPD or depression or anything really could be really triggering and not helpful for somebody else, because people's symptoms are different, and often it's usually only white wealthy people whose symptoms are observed in clinicians, which is why diagnosis often looks different as well.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a challenge, which is why I'm looking to be able to continue to expand that list and have more kind of thought-provoking games that touch on these themes, but not necessarily trying to educate you, but just more having, hey, this person is clearly like having delusions, or they're having a persistent low mood, and it's not necessarily diagnosed as anything, it's just who they are. Because often, especially in the UK, you don't get diagnoses very easily, as we know. And so I think it's really hard to sometimes promote games that maybe focus on a diagnosis only rather than the symptoms that come with it. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of different representations, and you can visit the website if you want to like look at a list of stuff that I've curated. And they're all on there for different reasons. So yeah, it's like I don't know. It's not an easy question to answer.
No, I mean, I can't say there's ever been a point where we've had someone on the podcast go, yep. And that's it.
Imagine. It'll be a very short podcast.
Yeah. Like, it's usually a case of like, you can think of maybe one that you particularly enjoy, but then there's obviously there's always going to be a mixture of feelings, there's always going to be a mixture of opinions, and it's more about, it's thought-provoking to think about our media consumption in a way of what are we consuming and what are we taking away from those characters, those scenarios, and those stories that we're taking in, and how can we share those positive ones, or those ones that give us a needed experience with others.
Yeah, because you often see like focused as well in the media is like the negatives that happen. I mean, the news is filled by tragedy all the time, which means you never usually get to see the positives unless nothing's happening, which is very sad. And I think that's very telling of our culture. And I don't know whether it's more than just British, but it's always focusing on the negatives and never really taking time to celebrate the goods. Which is so important because like you see so much good happening and then it's like, yeah, well, anyway, did you see that this happened? Is drama scary? Someone spat on Chris Pine. Yeah. Let's move away from the general situation that's happening and let's move on to something that doesn't mean anything. So yeah, I don't know. It's always a conversation, but I'm always trying to, we're at SAFE, we're always trying to look at positivity and look at the goods and highlight the goods instead of consistently focusing on the negative, because it doesn't actually do anything. Yeah. So
it always frustrates me when representation is half-baked as well. It's like where it's like, oh, swing and a miss, because I always think so when we first started doing the Through Our Eyes, I talked to some people with dissociative identity disorder, and we couldn't find a single good piece of representation. And I played Danganronpa, which has a character who is said to have dissociative identity disorder. And the really shitty thing about it is they actually got some more of the symptoms correct, in air quotes as it were, than a lot of other things I've seen, but they still demonized the character. They were still a serial killer in the game. And it was like, you nearly, like, they brought up things like that the two different sort of people, again, I'm doing lots of air quotes because my brain is struggling to find the correct words, but the two different alters didn't share memories, which is for a lot of people with dissociative, so with DID, is correct, and not many places will get that. They'll say that they're conniving because they all share memories, which isn't the case. And I'm like, how did you get so much of this right and still make them a killer? What is that's so frustrating, because you could have had a really wonderful, if simple, representation for something that's often demonized, but again, you just added to it, which is frustrating. And I would love to see some positive representation one day, but then you do get the other side where sometimes things are evangelized instead. Like, again, this isn't a mental health thing necessarily, but people with Down syndrome are often evangelized to be so happy and beautiful and pure, and people with Down syndrome are people.
Exactly what I was going to say is that you often see like characters who are represented and they're more about their So in like specific characteristic that they're trying to put on the person, let's say like words are hard, a mental health condition or a sexuality or like anything, and they make it all about that rather than actually that they're just a human being that happens to be depressed, that happens to be gay. And it's so disappointing because I'm just like, just create a character. Like it's about creating a person rather than filling in boxes at the last minute. So
yeah.
I think also, I mean, not to defend it, but with the pressure to have like representation, there is so much room for added error in that pressure because they want to fill a quota, and that's how they see it. It's a quota. They're trying to fill tick boxes to make it acceptable to whatever arbitrary terms they've been given. And so they're trying to, with a limited number of characters, they're removing the depth of a character by trying to put too much into one representative character, and then it's more of a caricature than it is a character at that point, because they're just like, oh, they've got this and they've also this and they're also this, and it just kind of means, well, you're not getting any wins really, because you're just confusing the things.
I think people are quite nervous as well to like embrace trying new things in games as well because of the added criticism. And I think that's partly due to the fact that often you don't see many protagonists in games necessarily that are like disabled or mentally ill or people of color. And so when people do have that, there's nothing to compare it to, and so people will be incredibly more critical of that naturally, because again, there's so many different things that they could do, and because they're not representative of every single person within that, then it's like, well, it's a letdown, right? But there are so many games out there that have got the same characters in them, they're just different outfits. And because you see yourself so much, you don't think about it. And so I think people have a right to be critical about it, but it's about finding a balance and being able to have an open discussion about creating represented characters in a way that is with people who are marginalised and with the people who you're trying to represent, which is always, I think, a step that people miss for some reason, which is wild to me. But yeah, empowering people to make the games that they feel represented in is important, and not consistently making the same action shooter with the same protagonist to 7 games, you know? So
I mean, I would be happy to see a action shooter game or war-based game where the actual main character has the PTSD that goes with being a soldier or a
you never see it, do you?
Have you played Spec Ops: The Line?
No.
Spec Ops: The Line may be a bit controversial because it has some very fucked up scenes in it, but it is, unfortunately, this is a bit of a spoiler, but it's the only way to really explain it, and I think it's one of those that it's one of those you have to play to really understand and believe. Like you said with The Last of Us, it is one of the very first games that ever hit me in my gut, and I was like, holy shit, I did not expect that to go the way it went. And without giving the entire story away, it is about a soldier with the effects of PTSD. But because it gives you the role of a player insert initially, you go through a bunch of the game like gleefully doing the things you would normally do in a shooter game until it starts to unravel the story around you and starts to reveal PTSD to you. And I was just like, for the first time, not that I understand, but I get what they're trying to tell me. And I think if you have the stomach to try that game, one, it played really well. It looked good. Unfortunately, it does still have the thing of, it's a white American dude up against a bunch of black and brown skinned people. But I think that's also the point, because it's meant to be a speech on, on the white savior complex and PTSD and veterans who are left behind and things like that. So I think in a lot of ways it has good representation, but because I'm not all those people, I can't say if it's perfect. But it is a game that I at least saw, played, and went, I didn't expect what I got, but I'm very glad I played it. You do have to be in a good headspace for it, because it will punch you.
Yeah. I find that with a lot of games, actually, especially the ones that I have to try and I'm like, oh dear God, I'm going to play half an hour of this and then I'm going to need to put it down because it's a lot. And that's the point of it for the most part. But yeah, I think touching on like PTSD as well, I do think that's one thing that The Last of Us Part 2 did quite well. In some parts in the state that obviously you see these people doing absolutely unspeakable things. Of course, it's going to affect them in some way, and maybe it's not the way that you would think it would be. But it's interesting the way that they portrayed like flashbacks and such. And yeah, it's interesting. No, I don't think any game is ever going to nail all of them. But it's good to point out the good in what we do see, so that then hopefully they can be replicated well and continue to be seen as best practice for other developers and such. So yeah.
Okay, so before we move on to audience questions, I wanted to finish up with a question about what's your takeaway from your experience and what good has come of it?
From my personal mental health experience, I mean, I think it's made me a lot more empathetic, and I think a lot of people say that. And whilst I don't think you need to go through trauma to be an empathetic person ever, it's helped me see things from a very different point of view, and made me really value the people who do make me feel safe and valued and valid. Because before, I think I was very accepting of people, just walking all over me, treating me like garbage. I was like, well, I deserve it. No, I didn't actually. And so it's very stereotypical of people going through shit and then actually coming out kind of like feeling stronger. But you do, like, I feel more emotionally resilient. Something that would have absolutely floored me 6 years ago is kind of like, it's a Tuesday now, it's whatever.
And that's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's not either, it's just a thing, right? Because it's like, well, yes, you've become more resilient, but also it's not a bad thing to be soft, and I think that's important as well. You don't have to become this hard shell of someone to be able to get through life. It's okay to show emotion, it's okay to do that. I think it's becoming more self-accepting of what you're feeling and allowing yourself to feel that instead of kind of putting it away and manifesting it into something worse. So I think it's taught me on a lot about myself and a lot about how I think, even though it's still a mystery to me for the most part, as I'm sure everyone thinks as well, trying to figure out your own brain is really hard because you're always observing it from one point of view. But yeah, I just think it's made me, ironically, I was going to say, it's made me more eloquent about talking about mental health. And I think it has, because I didn't used to be as good as I am now, which is still not great, but it's getting there. I have more confidence in being able to talk about things that I would usually hide away from ever mentioning. So I'm like learning how to be proud of myself in things that I would usually dismiss as just being, the everyday, the basic. So yeah, it's been a journey, and it's not to say that I'm not still on it. I'm very much on like a roller coaster of sorts with mental health, but it's been amazing to be able to work with and talk to so many people who are like so passionate about helping people in different ways and understanding community in a way that's incredibly a lot more inclusive. So yeah. I think that's it. I think that's my answer. I also saw I saw the incident over there. Are you okay?
Oh, I flashbanged myself changing tab quickly. Oh. I'm good. I'm good.
I did see your face like light up, and then like a second went by, and then it was just pain. So
I have double astigmatism, so all lights kind of go woof anyway. So I'm just
no.
it's all good. We're fine. Don't worry, I'm good. Had a moment.
Pan, do you have any questions that you wanted to cover before we move on to audience questions? I say questions, audience question.
Audience
So
question.
get your questions in now.
Get your questions in chat. I don't think I have anything specific. Apart from, I guess I could just ask. So one thing. So start from the beginning, Brain.
Mhm.
A little while ago, I did a mental health first aid training course, which was set up by Safe in Our World, which was fantastic, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I've done a mental health training course before that. And trigger warning, I do just want to touch on the subject of suicide, because it is something that a lot of people are really shocked about in the training session. And it's not a thing that a lot of people want to talk about or want to acknowledge or have any idea what to deal with or how to deal with it if it comes up. So do you have any advice for people, Rosie, if somebody is feeling suicidal, or if a friend tells them that they are, like, because most people would just say, kind of, just don't say anything or they'll do it, and that's not the case at all.
Yeah, there's a lot of tropes as well in like media, again, that's just like people doing stupid shit and then it suddenly fixes them and they're not suicidal anymore, which is not the case. It's a tricky subject for a lot of people because it's very personal and it's not like an all or nothing. It's like, oh, we're talking about suicide now, like this is something that's very real. And for a lot of people it's, again, incredibly stigmatized to the point where they won't even engage in a conversation about it, which I think is why it's all the more important to discuss this. Is actually World Suicide Awareness Day on Saturday, and so we'll be talking a little bit about it at Safe in Our World on social media as well. But it's because suicidal is like, I think people associate it with like incredibly unstable, which isn't necessarily the case. Like I've felt it in the past, and not ever thought I would act on it for the most part. And I think I was scared to even tell people because their reaction would be, oh my God, what the fuck? Which is not the way that you should react to someone if they tell you that they're really struggling and considering taking their life. But it's also very important to recognize that you're not a professional and you can't, people are trained to be able to support people who are feeling this way. And it's not a failure to send someone to a professional or to offer them resources that could potentially save their life. Like, you don't need to take on the responsibility of talking someone down and making sure that they're safe. Like, of course, that's a huge part of it, but there are people who are trained to do that. And so you don't have to do it alone. Like, you can get support, you can get advice. These helplines are not just necessarily, like Samaritans, for example, they're not just for people who are in crisis mode. They're also for people who maybe don't know how to deal with other people in crisis mode. Because if you can't force someone to get support if they don't want it, which is a really hard pill to swallow, but it's true. But you can do everything you can to support them other than that in a way that you're comfortable with. And so having like a bank of resources to be able to share is always really good, really helpful, especially when we live in a society that is very digital. It is very easy to share these sorts of numbers and support lines and text-based things, which is something that I would have loved at the time where I was at lowest. It's really hard to talk on the phone to someone if you're in the worst state ever. Or like potentially if you can't speak because you live in an unsafe place, or if you live in a place where no one knows that you're feeling this bad. So having more accessible ways to be able to talk to professionals who know how to deal and support you is critical. But ultimately, I think the main thing is they're a human being. You don't have to, I think people get so nervous and tread on eggshells with people, but they are still people. Be non-judgmental if you possibly can. It's really hard to do that, actually. And if you've gone on the mental health course, you'll know as well, like, because of like biases and stuff that you already have in your life, it's very difficult to listen non-judgmentally. But often just listening is a huge part, because a lot of people feel like they can't talk to someone. So if someone comes up and tells you that they're feeling this way, I mean, it's probably showing a huge sign of trust and strength that they're able to do that in the first place, because it's incredibly difficult to say that. So just offering a space for them to be themselves and not have to feel like they're hiding this big secret is very valuable. But not being the sole responsibility is also important, because people talk a lot about supporting suicidal people, of course, but then they forget the aftercare of the person who had to support that, because it does have an effect on you as well. So it's finding a balance. It's admitting when you need help and not taking on too much when you're not qualified to do that. You can still be a friend to a suicidal person. You don't have to be their therapist. So, but again, that's just my opinion. I think everyone else has a different one, but just be a good person. Don't take on too much, and know where you can get additional support for yourself and the person struggling.
It's one of those things that as a streamer, you'll often, well, not often, but you can end up with some people treating you as a therapist, or you may get somebody coming into a stream and saying, I feel suicidal, help me. And it can be really scary to have no idea what to do with that, and for it to derail everything. But yeah, I think validating that is a legitimate way for somebody to feel, but that you are not the person equipped to deal with it is okay.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're just not.
Yeah. The best thing you can do a lot of the time is validate, listen, and signpost them to where they should be going, because you're listening to them, you're validating their experience, but you're also putting them in the hands of a professional. That word is hard. Although I know how much darker my background has gotten, it's really depressing. It's so sad. You can see like there's no light outside anymore.
So grey outside.
Oh.
I mean, there's a reason that it's called a support network. It's not meant to be just one person that is the sole support. It's supposed to be a group or a collective resources of help. I mean, there's not one thing that can fix suicidalness or mental health issues. It's a collective of options. That's why no one can ever give you just a direct answer of how can I stop this? Because it's such a
there's a lot to unwind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Let's get on to audience questions. So, did you ever consider trying anti-anxiety medication instead of antidepressants? As personally, it was my anxiety causing my depression most of the time. And a lot of the anxiety medications can also help with chronic pain.
I never had the option to. I was very much told, we're going to try you on this now. And unfortunately, often that's how it goes. I think if you have a good rapport with the person who is, dispensing medication and whatnot, maybe you have a better say. I just didn't. But I think it's really important to be able to try a lot of different things to see what works best for you. Because as we've said, doctors don't actually know an awful lot about antidepressants and how they interact with us. So it's important that if you don't think something's working as it should be, to say that and try and work towards a different solution. I think I would be really interested in anti-anxiety specifically rather than antidepressants, because I do think it's like a cure-all for a lot of doctors to be like, oh, just have these, you'll be fine. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I very heavily agree. Antidepressants are now the equivalent to what pain meds were decades ago. It's just pop some of these. So it was like antibiotics as well. Just pop some of these, because it's you have an issue, this is what we have, rather than let's see what it is that is the root cause and therefore try and tackle it appropriately. And I know I personally have been prescribed antidepressants for period, obviously depression, pain management, and then just I could put you on antidepressants.
It might help.
I don't see how that's gonna help any of these things that I came to you for, but sure, okay. It's one of those things that's more of a do this first and then we can tackle, rather than a tackle and then we decide. And yeah, I don't think anyone really tends to get a choice on which one they go on first. It's usually just whichever one's in that particular doctor's favourite of the day.
Yeah. When I first went on medication, I was just honestly so relieved to have anything that I would have taken whatever they gave me. I was just like, oh my God, I'm so happy that someone like finally listened to me. I'll have it.
Yeah, I mean,
not a good mindset to have, but it was the one I had at the time. So
see, I was the opposite. I am not going on medication until the bitter end, and that was probably why I had so many issues for so long. It's because I refused to take the meds.
Understandable though. They don't tell you all the risks that are associated with that. Like when I first went on fluoxetine, which is the one I'm on now, they neglected to tell me that actually if I had X amount of fluoxetine, it would make my birth control pill much less effective, which they just didn't tell me, and I had to be told by someone on the internet that was a thing, which is terrifying. So yeah, there's a lot of research to be done around medication. Don't just like accept it, because it's the list of, I think I saw it in the chat earlier on as well, like one of the side effects of antidepressants is depression, and I'm like, what is the point? But again, it varies. So
yeah. Plus, there's things like people don't tell you that being on something like an antidepressant can cause you to struggle in the heat way more. So if you're in the middle of a heat wave, you may find yourself passing out because you've gotten too hot, because the antidepressant you're on, which you wouldn't expect to like cause any problems with sweat or heat retention, does. And so you have to keep on top of that as well. But I mean, I was the same as you, Rosie. I was like, Jesus Christ, please give me something to help. I want to try and figure this out. Whereas like my husband and my partners in the past have all been so reticent on it, because especially, and they were all male, they all felt it was a failure, and that, you know, emotionally they should just be able to get on with it, which is another issue with mental health, is the societal pressure of being a man. And you can have poor mental health as a cisgendered man. It is okay. And it really does, it hurts my heart that so many like young boys and men are told they can't have emotions when they can, and then they end up in an even worse position because it's never been validated for them.
Yeah, it's really sad, and you see it a lot, and I think that's why a lot of people, especially young men, turn to video games in a sense, because they can just outlet their emotions elsewhere, and it doesn't have to be in real life, quote unquote. So, you know, it's very sad that I feel like people can't have these conversations as a part of a normal day. Like I'm very privileged now to be in a position where I have colleagues and friends and a social circle that are very, not tolerant because that's the wrong word, but very supportive and open with this kind of discussion, where not everyone has that privilege and not everyone is in a safe position to be able to do so. So it's yeah, it comes from a privileged place as well, and I think it's important to remember that.
Okay, next question. What would you say is something simple that consumers can do to influence the creators to be more open to add even small but well-represented mental health into games, I assume?
Oh, that is a hard question. I mean, well, don't support bad gaming. It does send a message, like, I'm kind of joking, kind of not. With games where you see zero or harmful representation or harmful lack of representation, a lack of support can be very telling to people who are maybe looking to make another game. it's very difficult because I think a lot of people, consumers specifically, feel like their voice is not heard because there's a vast wave, a sea of gamers that all shout into the void and nothing really gets listened to. But that's not necessarily the case. And I was at a conference recently, listening to someone talk about old school RuneScape and how they have now implemented, well, they have done it for a while, but they have a polling system. So you vote on what content you want to see in the game, which is really interesting to me because it's a terrifying concept for a lot of designers because they've given up their creativity and they're putting the future of a game in the hands of the public, which is often a scary thing to do. But it's actually been really interesting because everyone who has been voting, it has to have like a 75% pass rate and stuff. So players and consumers are very much in control of the content that goes into the game. And that's why it has such a dedicated fan base, which is fascinating to me because you don't really see that in any other games.
No.
And so I do think like your voice matters more than you think it does. And people rally for change on social media all the time, and it happens. Like I had a podcast with someone called Momo Misfortune, who, if I'm sure you're familiar already, but they rallied for custom pronouns in The Sims 4, and it happens. They did that. That actually is a thing in the game now, which is incredible. So the power of social media is very it's influential, and I think it's important to be able to get these things across and to let people know when something is not okay, because that's often a huge sign. Like, companies know they fucked up if they post something on Twitter and it's got more quote tweets than normal tweets. Like, they know that they've done something bad, right? And you have a voice, you have a say. People take note of that. People's tweets have gone into like IGN and stuff. Like, you are listened to more than you think. So not being afraid to actively challenge game devs, not in a harassing way or not in a disrespectful way, because as a community manager, you get treated as though you're not a person behind the brand. I totally understand that. However, I feel like I have to preface everything I say. You can send God, what is the word? Not criticism. Feedback, constructive feedback, to developers directly, and they will probably see it. So it's worth having your voice heard in that respect if you want to see change happen. But also celebrate the games that are doing it really well. Like, that's a really important thing, is that people will be like, oh my God, have you seen this amazing game that actually it's got different pronoun options, it's got different sexualities represented in the game. Like, there's so many different diverse characters within this game, and I love it, and that's why. And you see them take off because communities rally behind it and they're like, this is awesome, we love this. And so that's very telling as well to other developers who are maybe hesitant to try that as well and just go for the safe option. So there's a few different things, but yeah, highlight the good and shout out the bad in short.
Yeah, and very much I want to emphasize that it is a good shout to actually highlight the good. Like seriously, rally behind the good ones. Yes. Actually compliment people on their work, because we're so, as was mentioned earlier, media is news and all that is always full of negative stuff, and can pretty much guarantee that the stuff that will go viral is going to be the stuff that's the bad stuff. But it's so important to actually tell people when they're doing good, when they're actually having a positive effect, when something is stuck out to you, and actually tell them and tell the devs and tell them that, yeah, you really liked this thing that they did, and well done on putting that representation out there, because they don't get to hear that.
No.
Like, it's like gold dust. They do not get to hear that. It's only when something doesn't work or isn't
But it's also important to highlight the good so that when people aren't getting it right, you can showcase what they could be doing,
Yeah.
or some inspiration at least as to where they could be working towards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same
When
goes
I
for...
worked in the game,
Sorry, go on.
sorry, I was going to say, when I worked in the games industry, because I was in the games industry for nearly 5 years, I actually did have a folder of screenshots saved of nice things people said, and there was 20 in there, because every single day was just a barrage of hate, death threats, and other nasty things. And yeah, saying you like something is so helpful, especially when you do, because people only talk when they don't like something. And it's very, very rare to actually say when you do like something in a very public way. But I then wrote a web article about harassment in the games industry, which made it to Reddit, which just resulted in a whole bunch of, well, she was probably just a weak pussy woman. And it was like, okay, right, you're not quite getting this one. It was 5 years of extended harassment that caused me to leave, not one case of grumpy boy on the internet. Yeah, tell people when you like shit.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same with just, I mean, it's anything, right? I mean, even reviews of products. People do not leave reviews unless something went wrong. Very few people actually go, yes, this was actually really good. I really enjoyed this.
It skews it as well so much, because then you'll see like one bad review and be like, well, it's not got any good reviews, so I guess it must be bad. It's like, hang on, that's not quite how it works. But I think that's one thing that Steam does quite well usually. When people love it, they will leave a nice review for the most part, because you'll see like overwhelmingly positive reviews and you're like, yay, this is nice. People are really happy about it, which is good. So
yeah. But that's the thing also, it's like, you know, if you've got an issue with only seeing negative news, do something about it. Put the positive news out there. There's literally an account on TikTok that is dedicated to good news in the world, and things like, you know, this advancement is being made on cleaning up the oceans, and this thing is happened today that and seriously, just any, even if there was like 5% more of that, it would make everyone's lives on social media especially a heck ton better. Just having that actual balance of the good and the bad.
It's about like who you share your spaces with as well. Like, it's important to, if someone is consistently making you feel bad on social media, it's okay to like mute them or unfollow. Like, it's not a big deal. It's really not. Feeling like you're comfortable in the spaces that you are in online, which is a lot of the time for a lot of people who spend time on social media and who are careers are involved in social media, like making those spaces as nice as possible can do a lot for your well-being.
It really can. One of the best things I ever did was go through and just be like, nope. Now my stuff's full of like fluffy cat pictures and people like building each other up, and just the only negative news I tend to get now on my social medias is when Twitch does something that no one likes.
And streamer hot takes.
Oh, not streamer hot takes.
It's the same for every quarter.
But
it's a bingo card, isn't it?
Pretty much.
It does make a huge difference. That, yeah, just having like fun game news and just people building each other up, and it does have a major effect even if you think it doesn't.
100%. One of like, I chat a lot of shit on Twitter, so I'm not really telling you to follow me because I wouldn't. But one of my most successful tweets is just me shouting about how excited I was that I got dungarees with dinosaurs on them. And that was like, oh my god, everyone was so happy. And I was like, this is a nice thing to have, actually. People like dumb shit that's happy. Yeah. It's fine.
There's a reason that most of the internet is made up of cat pictures.
Yeah. And engage with the happy shit when you see it as well, especially among like Black creators. You'll often see their grief going viral, whereas their success is don't, because people tend to skew towards negativity, and it's easier for everyone to be group outraged than group happy. So if you see something you're like, that's cute, just press the like button.
Yeah.
Just press it. It does nothing for you apart from add another 1,000 onto the amount of things you've liked, and that's fine. Liking things is a good thing.
Yes.
Like, support people.
And if you want to
Exactly.
see more of it, you have to interact with it.
Yeah, that's how algorithms
That's
work.
how the algorithm works. In all the social medias, if you don't interact with the good stuff, you're going to see more of the shit that you do interact with, and I'm telling you now, it's probably going to be the negative stuff.
Right. I don't even follow these accounts, but I know them because I see them every day. Like gators daily, it's just crocodiles and alligators, just pictures of them. And I don't know why, but I just think it's so great. Like capybaras are always on my Twitter feed, and then cats going goblin mode. And that's like my life. I don't even think I follow any of them, but they just consistently show up, and I'm not mad about it. So
Keep happening.
All right. Last question before we finish up. Do you have any horror stories from your work where someone was simply refusing to make good choices?
sorry, you cut out a little bit there, or I cut out a little bit there.
Do you have any horror stories from your work where someone was simply refusing to make good choices?
Oh, yeah, my manager. Not in this job. Oh my god, no, I love my manager now.
So I say, it's like, that's a dangerous road to be taking.
Ooh, went straight in there.
A previous manager in a previous role was just a bad person. Like, I don't know what to say. I was having panic attacks a lot because I was being worked 12, 14 hours a day, and then living in a hotel, and then coming back to work 12, like every day, 7 days a week. Notorious, of course, my mental health was suffering because of it, and I started having panic attacks at work because I was, having a bad time. And she literally told me to come downstairs and get back to work. I don't know what I was thinking. Like, she didn't understand what was going on. When I told her I was having a panic attack, she was like, right, okay, well, I've made you a really nice like a desk area downstairs. And I was just like, great. I want to leave in every way possible. I need to go. And so yeah, that was one of them. And then, oh god, she was just the worst. All of my extra time that I logged during that sort of 6 months was written off, and I wasn't allowed to take it back. So I got paid the same amount to do about 3 people's jobs, which was terrible. Yeah, basically just had no support during one of the most stressful times in everyone's life. So it was not fun. That was probably my worst nightmare. And then this person also, oh god, if you don't like her now, you won't like her after I say this. When the BLM protests were happening in London, she said, "Isn't that racist towards white people?" And I was like, I need to go. I can't have this conversation with you right now. And yeah, that was honestly part of the reason why I left as well, because I was like, you're just a terrible person. But okay. So that was my worst one, I think. But there are horror stories out there everywhere of people being treated terribly at work. And it's not like it's more widespread than you think it is. So.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure we've all got from what I know of at least Man and Pan's experiences, I know that we have definitely got horror stories to talk about for hours, but yeah, it's very common. That's
so sad though that we have horror stories, but we don't have like examples of really supportive workplace. Well, we do, but like they're few and far between compared to the horror stories that you have.
I have a great one.
I feel like I have a horror
boss.
story right now with this.
No. Oh dear. Be your own boss. That's definitely the better way forward.
No, I love my boss now. I have a great time.
Well, I think that's the good takeaway that we can have there, is that just because you have the horror stories doesn't mean that the future doesn't hold the more positive experiences as long as you get out of there.
Exactly. Don't settle for bad managers if you have the opportunity to leave. I know it's not always that simple, but you don't deserve to be treated like shit at work. So
yeah.
Okay, right. Well, that is all we have time for today. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us. Is there any last tidbits, words of wisdom, things that you'd like to leave us with?
oh god, wisdom? Probably not. No, just be nice and be mindful of other people as well when you exist on the internet, I guess. I want to end on something happy. I feel like I've not ended on something happy. You're worthy of love. You're worthy of people giving you time and respect, and you're kicking ass more than you think you are. Done.
Mic drop. All right, could I get shout outs for Pan and our guest Rosie today, please? Go check them out, go spread some love. But yes, thank you Pan once again for co-hosting as per, and thank you again Rosie for joining us and talking to us. Your time is your most precious resource, and so we're very thankful that you chose to come and talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.
So next Through Our Eyes will be in 2 weeks. My next stream will be tomorrow. If you'd like to keep in touch outside of the Through Our Eyes podcast, go check out the social medias, the Twitters, the Instagrams, the various websites and TikToks and all of the things, and go join the various Discords. But yes, thank you all for hanging out. One thing from me, if you have sad or feel more down during the autumn months, be sure to dust off your lamps. No, okay.
Good job there, Drac. No, if anyone has seasonal affective disorder or starts to get more down during the autumn months, be sure to dust off your lamps ASAP, because you're going to start needing them very soon, but you won't recognize it until you're already feeling depressed because you kind of remembered. So get your bulbs sorted out and get your lamps and your blankets and have all those things set up so they're there and you don't get depressed before you need them. So...
But yes, thank you all for your time. Thank you all for hanging out. I hope you have a good rest of your evening. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I will see you all soon. Say bye all.
Hey.